So moving into this, like really getting into, the most sort of serious subject of the night and of the year, suffering broadly understood. Um, I was just curious, thinking about each of you both as people who are deeply humanistic and really honor the sciences and have an appreciation for mystery and, in your case, Alistair, a faith. Um, I think the older people get, they say, you can suffer your way to wisdom in many different ways, and obviously at different life stages. And there's a C.S. Lewis, who probably many of you watching would be familiar with, uh, it's famously said, he wrote two very different books about technically the same subject. And one was The Problem of Pain, which he wrote as a scholar. And the other was A Grief Observed as a Widower, which he wrote after his wife died. That's when he was widowed. And the first was very erudite and detached, and it's a wonderful philosophical volume. But the second was very personal and searing, and at times not incoherent, but just very raw. And you could sort of just see the cost of love lost. And so, just using that as sort of an example, when a society is healthy and well functioning, society can ideally be shared, at least somewhat. But in the context of our sort of present commons, at least in the US, and I think the UK probably has its own cast here, a lot of people feel sort of splitting apart at the seams. And then add COVID's own sort of discriminatory cast. It's killing some more than others. Some people in certain demographic groups are getting more than others, et cetera. To say nothing of just the isolating effects of social distancing. We see this sort of like panoply of human pain that's really uneven. And we're divided from each other's experiences in all of this. So I give that as a runway to ask each of you how you think about suffering, and in this year, the very uneven experience of suffering. How do you think about that in the context of this notion of control, and then sort of moving into this context of, the age-old question of theodicy? How does a good God allow suffering? Alistair, why don't we start with you? Just this relationship between unequal suffering and a God overseeing it.
Well, you asked some great questions. This is just the beginnings of an answer to the first part. I mean, I don't like suffering. I don't like it when other people suffer, but suffering is there. And, we've got to face up to this brute reality. It is there. And the question is not simply how we can make sense of it, which we can do, of course, at a biological level or a theological level. It's a deeper question, which is how do we cope with this? And even more than that, can we actually not just cope with this, but grow through this? And I think for me, one of the really interesting questions that emerges from COVID, because the question I find myself asking, me is, how can I become a better person as a result of this? That to me is a very important challenge. And you've raised, I think, a very good question, which is COVID has exposed inequality. If you like, it's a lens which has really shown us that there are certain groups of people, those who live very tightly and closely together, those who don't have access to healthcare, who actually really are feeling the pain a lot more than others. So if you like, our structures have made this worse. And that's a very unsettling thought. But of course, you want me to talk a bit about how I bring God into this, because I think that's really the big item on the agenda. And I think what I would say is this, that obviously we could talk of this in purely philosophical terms, an all-powerful, all-loving God, but I'm kind of very suspicious of these philosophical absolutizations. I think very often they're very abstract. And what I want to say is really, from a Christian perspective, it's almost as if you're focusing on Christ and saying, look, he suffered, he really went through it. And actually, we can take hope from that. There's a certain sense in which the early Christians, for example, suffered quite a lot, had a rough deal, but they saw Christ as someone who would stay with them during their suffering. And so for me, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about the intellectual side of things, but that's part of it, but it's not the only thing. It's a sense that you are not alone in suffering, that in effect you are walking, if you like, to quote from Psalm 23, with a God who is present with you even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And that's not about evading big issues. It's about saying, I'm not on my own. Because I'm being accompanied and comforted, I can begin to do things. I can become, I can be an agent who tries to do something to help those who are suffering, and perhaps also make this world a better place. So there is a theoretical question here, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, but there's also a question about how we rise to the challenge that we are being confronted with this. And for me, actually, that's a really interesting question. It's not just about knowledge of why this is here, it's about wisdom, which is a different kind of knowledge, about how we act wisely to try and learn from this and try to, in effect, ask, what has COVID exposed about us as people and about our society that we might pay attention to? I think that's a very interesting question, which I don't think it's going to go away. But that's just the beginnings of an answer to a very good question.